Jackson Miller retired 15 years ago. Now he sits in his favorite window seat, watching the picturesque sunset through the large panoramic windows of his suburban home. He's settled in with a cup of hot tea in his hands, burying his gaze in the golden light that comes through the curtains. All that was left for him was old age, peace, and the confidence that he had worked his whole life to provide for himself and his family in these last years. Jackson always believed in stability. He was an engineer who worked for a large company for over 30 years. During this time, he created many projects, helped build the city, and was proud of his life. Everything he did, every step in his career, was aimed at one thing: a comfortable old age when he could sit on the porch, read books, and not worry about whether he would have enough money to last until the end of the month. He remembered how many years ago he had planned his future. A family, a house, a summer cottage, all made possible by his determination and hard work. Jackson had everything he needed to be happy. And he also had savings, money for retirement, which he had carefully set aside, planning to live a carefree life. He invested in stable, time-tested funds, and he never doubted for a moment that his decisions were right. When he retired, his life was supposed to be rosy. Jackson and his wife Lydia began to dream of traveling, visiting new cities and countries. They even planned to go to Europe, visit ancient castles, walk the streets of Paris and Rome, enjoying the peace and quiet that old age brings. Jackson dreamed of long evenings on the beach with a cup of wine, of fun gatherings with friends and family. Everything he needed to be happy was right in front of him. However, as often happens in life, this ideal image did not correspond to reality. Jackson's years of peace and quiet joy slowly began to give way to unpredictability and doubt. The first warning signs came when his friend Peter, whom he had known since they were young, told him about a new profitable investment. Peter was a financial advisor and always had advice on the right opportunities. Jackson still believed in his experience and didn't hesitate when he suggested that he invest in an investment project that promised a great return. "Jackson, this is a real chance. The interest there is so high that even your retirement savings could be tripled in a year," Peter said in that phone call. Jackson had a lot of savings. He had worked all his life to provide for his family. Now this money was going to guarantee a secure and stable future. He had no doubt that this was the right thing to do. But without even realizing it, he was taking the first step toward a major disaster. He thought about Peter's offer for a long time. Of course, it sounded very tempting. And even Lydia, his wife, was initially interested, although she warned him to be careful. She was usually more cautious than he was, and not as trusting of any side opportunities. But Jackson convinced her that everything would be fine. "Don't worry, Lydia. I'm not a kid. I know how to manage money. Peter will never let you down," he said, trying to reassure his wife. Peter promised that this was a stable and reliable business, and that all investors would come out with a big profit. He convinced Jackson that it was worth a try. So Jackson did not hesitate. He transferred a substantial amount of money to the company's account, which promised incredible interest. "I've always dreamed of an opportunity like this," Jackson thought as he looked at his growing account. But he didn't know that every great promise comes with a price. The very money he sincerely hoped to use for his quiet life turned out to be part of a larger and more dangerous scheme he hadn't even realized. The time that Jackson spent in his cozy living room was supposed to be a period of waiting, because in his mind, old age was carefree. Now, everything began to change, and nothing could have warned him that everything would soon collapse. And even then, Jackson didn't realize that his dreams of a peaceful old age could be just an illusion. Several months had passed since Jackson had invested his savings in a so-called profitable investment. At first, everything seemed perfect. The money was growing, he was promised high interest rates, and even Lydia, who was skeptical at first, began to feel a little more relaxed. But one thing that remained unspoken began to cast a shadow over his confidence: frequent requests from Peter for additional infusions. Jackson, if you want to get even more, you need to make another small investment," were the words that came out every time Peter called. But each time these requests became so frequent that it began to bother Jackson. At first, he didn't pay attention to it because he was promised a big income. And then, gradually, he began to feel that something was wrong. After a couple of months, it became apparent that the promise of big profits was hiding more uncertainty than he could have imagined. During one of the calls, Peter said that the company was experiencing some difficulties, but he convinced Jackson that these difficulties were temporary and that now was the time to invest more money to reap huge dividends later. Temporary difficulties. These words became a real wake-up call for Jackson, although he did not yet realize how serious the situation would be. At the time, he did not even realize that these difficulties could be a sign that the company was not quite as Peter had painted it. If Jackson had listened to his inner voice, he would have noticed how often Peter asked for additional investment. At the same time, other signs began to bubble to the surface. Jackson began to notice that the financial reports coming out of the company were becoming less and less transparent. For the first few months, everything looked quite clear numbers, clear indicators. But now they began to blur. Unexplained expenses, the lack of detailed explanations for each item, all this began to make him suspicious. This doesn't look like what was originally promised, Jackson thought as he reviewed one of the latest reports. He sensed that something was wrong, but he wasn't ready to give up his beliefs and admit he was wrong. Too much was invested in this. And most importantly, he didn't want to lose his friend Peter, who had convinced him so many times that this was the right thing to do. Another warning sign came when Jackson tried to contact company representatives to clarify some things, but instead of the usual quick feedback, he received only silence. At first, it looked like a simple misunderstanding. But when the calls kept coming and his emails were not answered, Jackson began to worry. He tried to reach out to Peter, but he wasn't returning his calls as quickly as usual. He spent more and more time thinking and worrying. Lydia, who initially did not show much interest in the case, noticed changes in her husband's behavior. She saw Jackson become more nervous, start asking more questions every week, but still refused to talk about certain financial issues. Lydia tried to talk to him, suggesting that he consult consultants or check more details about the company, but Jackson brushed off the advice. "Don't worry, Lydia. I'm in control. You just have to wait a little bit. Not everything will be fine," he said, not even noticing how these words sounded less and less convincing. With each passing month, Jackson began to notice more and more contradictions. It seemed that the more he tried to find out, the more doubts he had. And the more time he spent looking for answers, the more he realized that there was something much more serious behind the story than he could have imagined. He began to ask himself the question, could this all be a hoax? Had he become part of a huge pyramid scheme? But even realizing this, Jackson continued to believe that everything would be resolved, that the problem would soon disappear. He did not want to admit that he could be deceived. Therefore, every new call, every new bill that appeared on his account, he simply put aside, believing that it was only a temporary difficulty. The anxiety continued to grow, but Jackson could not and would not believe that his dream of a carefree old age could so suddenly turn into a disaster. Jackson did not stop to doubt. With each new stage, he fell more and more into the comfort zone that Peter and his partners created for him. They promised everything possible: stable income, safe investments, reliability. Though everything looked so good that even when small doubts began to appear in his mind, he tried to push them aside. After all, he had worked so hard to reach this moment of peace that he couldn't just give up his beliefs. However, the more Jackson invested, the more he fell into the trap. He did not even notice how this trap began to become his reality. At first, all these promises didn't seem so important, but now they were becoming the basis of his hopes. He no longer asked himself, is it really that profitable? Instead, he lived the dreams that were built around this financial gain. All his attempts to check more details or find out what was behind it were postponed. The dream of a carefree old age was becoming so important that he could not see any other options. With each new investment, Jackson deepened his dependence on the scheme. He could no longer give up the idea that he just had to wait a little longer, and then everything would be fine. With each new contribution, he felt more important in this big game, as if he had become part of something huge. Time passed, and his dream became more and more dependent on this market. With each new step, he became more and more deeply involved in a mechanism that seemed to be safe. But the trap was ready. Jackson did not notice how it was gradually closing in on him from all sides. His calls to Peter became less and less frequent. At first, he just waited for answers, to which he never received concrete explanations. Then, when Peter started ignoring his calls, he decided to go to the company's office himself. However, when he arrived, he found the doors locked and the office no longer existed. It was the first wake-up call that something was very wrong. His heart went cold when he saw the emptiness that remained in the place where he had felt so calm and confident just a few weeks earlier. Then Jackson began to realize more and more that he was trapped. Everything on which he had built his idea of a carefree old age was now fragile and dangerous. His money, which was supposed to be his retirement savings, had become the subject of manipulation and deception. Lydia noticed a change in Jackson after the incident, and he was no longer calm, no longer had the confidence with which he used to talk about his financial situation. Now he was trying to keep everything under control, but it was too late. As she saw him waking up in the middle of the night, checking his emails, writing messages to people who had probably disappeared from his life long ago. She felt that something was being hidden from him and finally decided to ask him directly. Jackson, you don't tell me everything. What happened? Why have you changed so much? You're not the same person I knew anymore, she said one night. Her words were painful, but Jackson couldn't even answer right away. He just sat there and stared into the void, trying to comprehend all these changes. He knew that Lydia was right, that it couldn't go on like this for so long, but he was trapped by his promises. And even though he realized he was in a difficult situation, his pride and hope for great financial success kept him committed to the goals that seemed so important. The fact that he could not simply admit his mistake now became another part of the trap, and all his attempts to fight the situation became even more pointless, because the more he tried to break free, the more he became part of what he wanted to get rid of. Yet even at this point, Jackson failed to recognize how deeply he was involved in a game he had organized for himself. He didn't realize that he was no longer in control of the situation, but simply waiting for the outcome, which, unfortunately, would no longer be what he had dreamed. Jackson was sitting on the couch, his gaze blurred and full of uncertainty. Lydia, sitting next to him, couldn't help but notice the changes that had taken place in him since the events that had begun to unfold around the investment he had been hoping for. All these promises of prosperity and wealth had seemed so real, but now even in his own home he felt uncomfortable. A heavy atmosphere of uncertainty. Every day Jackson checked his investments. At first it was small amounts, but over time he invested more and more, hoping for a big profit. He felt his hope growing and the power this chance to change everything was giving him. However, now this hope was gradually fading into the background, leaving only a void. With each new review of the investment balance, Jackson began to feel that things were not going as he had imagined. The first signs of losses appeared gradually. At first, they were minor changes in the reports that didn't cause much concern. But when he realized that the amount he had invested was not only not increasing, but was actually decreasing, his heart immediately went cold. At first, It seemed to him to be just a coincidence. After all, who doesn't have problems in business? But if it were that simple, he wouldn't have fallen into this trap. As he started looking for answers, his calls to Peter became less and less frequent. And Peter no longer answered his messages, and his company seemed to have vanished into thin air. As the weeks passed, Jackson began to suspect that something serious had happened. However, he couldn't immediately believe that his investment would not be returned. He still hoped for a miracle, that everything would work out. But with each passing day, his uncertainty became more and more apparent. And then came the first big loss. Then Jackson decided to make one last attempt. He went to the same office where he had gone a few weeks earlier, confident in his investment, hoping to prosper. However, now that he was there, everything had changed. The office was closed, and there was a sign on the door with just a few short words on unethical, Project Restart. Sorry for the inconvenience. Everything fell into place. And this was not just a delay or technical difficulty. It was the first serious sign that he had fallen for the scammers. With each passing day, his doubts grew deeper. What scared him even more was that he no longer knew who to turn to. All that was left of his investment seemed to be lost to him forever. Lydia saw her husband gradually sink into depression, and his confidence in the future crumbled like a house of cards. She could not keep silent. "What am I, Jackson? What are you going to do? This doesn't seem like a temporary problem. Maybe we should go to a lawyer," she asked, trying to find a way to support him. But Jackson, although he realized that things could be worse, couldn't quite believe it. How could he have so easily believed and naively invested so much money in something that had nothing to do with real investment? With each new step he took, he felt more and more that his financial world was falling apart. He started looking for advice on the internet, learning more about investment scams, but what he was learning only made his situation worse. Looking through forums and stories of people who had experienced similar situations, he realized that there were tens of thousands of people like him. He is not alone. Many people have lost their money in the same way. And this is just the beginning, he thought. Jackson began to feel that the loss was not just a financial problem. It was something more. It was a loss of faith in his own abilities, in his own judgment. Although he sought comfort in the fact that he was not alone, it did not make his situation any better. Every day it was becoming harder for him to come to terms with the lost opportunities, with how everything had come to an end when he simply ignored the signs that warned of danger. Lydia was there for him, but even she didn't know how to support him in this situation. He felt betrayed and used, and nothing she said could bring back the peace he had been seeking for so long. And he began to doubt whether there was any chance of avoiding this disaster at all. Every day, Jackson himself the same question. How could I have been so blindly trusting? After he discovered that his investment had become an empty promise, he still couldn't believe he was trapped. His hopes, his dreams, which he had so bravely woven together, seemed to him a distant, almost ridiculous memory. But he was even more tormented by another question: was this deception really unexpected, or did he just not want to see the obvious? Lydia noticed a change in his mood. Jackson became withdrawn, and most of his thoughts remained out of her reach. She could see him checking his financial reports and getting lost in thought, but she couldn't help. They began to drift apart more and more, and this was beginning to worry her even more than the financial crisis that was steadily deepening. Then one evening, after Jackson came home from another loss, he decided to take a decisive step. He couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer and felt like he was slowly drowning in this sea of lies and unfulfilled hopes. "Lydia, I can't take it anymore. I have to know the whole truth," he said quietly but firmly. She looked at him, meaning that this could be the turning point. Now he was ready to go all the way, and she decided to support him in this. They both knew it was going to be hard, but how else could they deal with this situation? Even though they were already on edge, Jackson was determined to uncover the lie. He began his investigation with the smallest details. First, he went back to the same investors and parties he had talked to before, but this time he was more attentive to every detail. He reviewed all the contracts, letters, correspondence, and even meetings that took place during his investment. It all looked like normal legal documentation that he hadn't paid attention to when he received these promises. When he looked at them now, he could see how many ambiguities and contradictions they contained. That same evening, Jackson came across a document that came as a real shock to him. It was signed by Peter, his business partner, and it described financial manipulations that were intended not only to divert money, but also to completely plunge investors into a debt hole. This was what Jackson was looking for. But what struck him even more was the fact that Peter was not just manipulating funds, but deliberately misleading people, knowing that his scheme would inevitably lead to bankruptcy. Jackson couldn't sleep all night. His brain was working, analyzing everything he had learned. Now he saw how his money, and the money of many other investors, had been used not for real investment, but to maintain the illusion of prosperity, while the organizers of the scheme, including Peter, took the money for themselves. It was a cruel game to play with people who, like him, were full of hope for a better future. Lydia, seeing Jackson unfolding these documents and increasingly confronted with the painful truth, fell onto the couch next to him. You know now, don't you?" she asked quietly, realizing that he was on the verge of disappointment. "Yes, I do. I realized I was trapped. But I'm even more impressed with how this guy took everything I had and more. And he was not alone. The whole system was built on lies," he said, his face tense with indignation. Lydia could not believe what she was hearing. She looked at him, realizing that they were now on the verge of a struggle that did not promise easy solutions. She was prepared for the fact that this might not just be a financial battle, but a fight for their relationship. "We have to do something. It can't stay the way it is," Lydia said, her voice trembling a little, but she was stubborn in her desire to find a way. Jackson felt that they were on the threshold of a new reality, that uncovering this lie was only the beginning, and now they had to decide what to do next. But no matter how the situation turned out, he could not go back. Now, it all depended on how they would overcome this journey together. Jackson could feel his heart clenching with pain. He couldn't believe that his closest partner and friend, with whom they had made plans for their retirement together, was just another fraud. Everything he had built up all his life began to crumble right before his eyes. Not only money, but also trust, and most importantly, the sense of security he had, disappeared in an instant. Lydia sat next to him and looked at her husband. She was as shocked as he was. Disappointment and anger overwhelmed her, but even more so was her palpable indifference to what had happened. She realized that their path together would inevitably change. She could no longer be with him if he was unable to see reality as it was. "Why didn't you tell me before?" asked Lydia, her voice sounding as if it were from another reality. "We could have discussed it. We could have looked for a way out together. You're kidding, of course, that you did all this alone. Do you really think I would have let you drown in all of this without getting you help?" Jackson looked up at her. His face was exhausted, and his eyes no longer held the confidence he had before. He realized that the lack of honesty was the point at which they could no longer go back to the way they were before. All that remained was to figure out how to survive what had happened. Kneeling again in front of his own failure, he realized that there was no excuse for what had happened. "I didn't know what else to do. I was just scared. Scared of losing everything I had. And I was even more scared of losing you," Jackson said. His voice broke and he lowered his head. "I may have taken the easy way out to avoid bothering you. But now I see that it was a big mistake. I couldn't afford to live such a lie, but losing you is too much." Lydia listened to him, but there was no more sympathy in her eyes. She felt only bitterness. because betrayal is not only about finances. It was in every word, every step they took together. What seemed impossible had become a reality. They had lost not only their money, but most importantly each other. "Don't you realize you've broken my trust?" Lydia said loudly. Her words were full of disappointment. You've been living a lie, and I never thought your game would be so deep. You took everything I had, and now you can't even look me in the eye." He was silent, feeling empty. Oh, what difference did it make what he could say if they were on the verge of breaking up? It was hard for him to accept, but he realized that he had made a huge mistake that he could not go back on. How could he have trusted so blindly in someone who had other goals? How could he believe in financial illusions when there was so much manipulation in the world? Jackson sank down on the couch, his head bowed. The feeling of inner breakdown was becoming unbearable. But Lydia could no longer be with him in this lie. She left the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts and mistakes. The day that began with hope had now become a tragic reality. Jackson knew that he may have lost everything he wanted to achieve. Not only had he lost his money, he had lost his family and his trust. What could be worse than the realization that you have deceived yourself and your loved ones? The next morning he woke up and Lydia was no longer at home. She left a note that he found on the table. "I can't be with you anymore. You made your choice and I have to live my life. I'm sorry, but I can't go this way with you." The note was short, but it contained everything she needed to understand. She could no longer stay by his side. She had long since stopped believing that they would be able to regain their former intimacy, and Jackson was left alone with his unrealistic reality. What had seemed so stable had collapsed in an instant, and now that he was losing everything, he began to wonder, is it possible to go back, or have we already lost the chance? Jackson felt that every step was getting harder and harder. He sat in his small office, looking through the papers that had become symbols of defeat for him. He had lost more than just money. His heart was beating louder as he thought about what was left of the disaster. No more plans, no more dreams of a carefree old age, and no more hopes that he could get it all back. He didn't just his finances, he lost his dignity, and more importantly, his relationships. Lydia had left him. It was harder than he could have ever imagined. She didn't just leave him physically. She left him in the very loneliness that he feared most. She left home, and that was the final blow. Jackson knew that with her departure, he had lost another element of stability in his life. And now he had to find a way to regain some confidence that all was not lost. He began to seek help, looking for ways to rebuild his business, his finances, and his relationships. But each day seemed harder and harder, and Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he was wasting time trying to close the wound that was hurting more and more. He became more withdrawn, feeling like a failure. There were no more light conversations, laughter, or plans for the future. He couldn't even look at his phone without being reminded of his broken relationship with Lydia. Jackson spent a long time trying to find answers on how to fix things. He consulted financial advisors and did everything he could to restore the business, but his heart was increasingly filled with anxiety. However, even though he tried to cope with the situation, he still felt trapped. Emma, meanwhile, with every step he took, he began to realize that in order to really move forward, he needed to change not only his finances, but his outlook on life. He decided that he would not give up. He started meeting with people who had gone through similar difficulties and sought out those who could support him. He even went to see a psychologist, hoping that a professional would help him get rid of the guilt that wouldn't let go. The first sessions were difficult. Jackson could not fully open up. He felt awkward, and it didn't feel like a normal conversation he would have with a friend. But it was the first step toward recovery. And although the situation seemed hopeless, he began to learn from the mistakes he had made. He began to realize that he needed to rethink not only his financial strategies, but also his attitude toward the people around him. Aoa Jackson began to think about how he had lost Lydia and why it was possible. This was his biggest disappointment, the realization that he had not only lost money, but also violated the most important principles of mutual understanding. Lydia contacted him repeatedly, but Jackson was still too emotionally affected to communicate properly. He didn't know how to put things back to the way they were, because he could see that her attitude was changing. But with each passing day, Jackson realized that everything was up to him. If he wanted to rebuild not only his finances, but also his relationship with Lydia, he needed to start with himself. He couldn't be the one who lost her trust again. One evening, as he sat in his office looking through old photos with Lydia, Jackson made a decision. He needed to show her that he was ready to change. Ace. So he started working not only on getting the money back, but also on becoming a better person for himself and for Lydia. He returned to the moments when their life together was simple and happy. He remembered how they laughed together, shared their dreams, and how naively they believed that old age would be easy and carefree. But Jackson also realized that after all this, they would not be able to go back to the way things were. Recovery is a difficult and painful process, and while he was doing his best to right his wrongs, he knew it wouldn't be instantaneous. But at least he was willing to fight. He didn't give up because, even in the darkest moments, he realized that life doesn't end, and there is a chance to start again. Recovery is not only about financial stability, but also an emotional and psychological process. Jackson realized that the real struggle was to learn to trust again, to be honest and responsible. Though whether he could do it remained an open question. Jackson sat in the courtroom, his gaze blank but piercing. He looked at the faces of the lawyers, at the judges, at the people who were trying to decide his fate, and he realized one thing: the justice he was looking for was far from what he had imagined. It was not what he had hoped for. What was supposed to be fair and cleansing had turned into another game where money and influence decided everything, not truth and justice. Despite all his efforts and financial expenditures, everything fell into place only for those who could pay for the right decisions. He turned to lawyers, discussed strategies, but the more he delved into the process, the more he felt that it was just a business for many people, a business in which his grief and loss were just part of a big machine. After the Ponzi scheme began to fall apart and all his savings were wiped out, Jackson hoped that he could get at least some of his money back through the courts. He didn't expect a large recovery, but at least some compensation for what he had been through. However, his hopes began to melt like snow in the spring sun. Throughout the court hearings, he realized more and more that this was not a fight for justice, it was a fight for profit, for truth that could be bought. The first hearing caused him a lot of frustration. Only after a few hours did he realize that the judge was more interested in closing the case as quickly as possible than in establishing justice. The lawyers for one of the largest participants in the Ponzi scheme were so cunningly manipulating the facts that Jackson felt like he was in a bad dream. His lawyer looked powerless as he tried to make his case to a judge who seemed indifferent. Jackson saw his trust in the justice system disintegrate, his hope that he would find support and help lost. The judge did not look at him with respect, his gaze was cold and distant, as if this were a routine. Jackson, feeling his heart clenching, tried to control his emotions. But it was hard, because he realized that there was no victory for him in this fight. He tried to remain calm, but with every word from his lawyer, every reaction from the judge, Jackson felt his hopes melting away. Most of what he had expected from the court did not materialize. On the contrary, he felt that the judicial system was actually just adding another problem to the one he was already facing. But what really hit Jackson hard was the next hearing. This is when he began to realize how difficult it is to restore justice when the system itself is unable to provide it. Jackson tried to collect all the facts, contacted witnesses, provided many documents, but in the end, It looked like the judge was more interested in avoiding hassle than in finding the truth. Yet his case came into question, and Jackson felt his mood rapidly sink. He had more questions than answers, and it was becoming almost unbearable. He was no longer convinced that justice existed in the way he had imagined. At that moment, as he sat in the courtroom, looking at the faces of the judges, at the judgmental but indifferent lawyers, he began to doubt that this was the right path. Perhaps he had no chance of recovery. Maybe it was all just another trap. And even in the best-case scenario, after all this effort, he would be left with no money, no support, and no hope. Justice was supposed to be his salvation. But the more Jackson watched the whole process, the more he felt that this system was not designed to help him. It was just another part of a game where the important thing is not facts and truth, but how much you can pay to get a result. With each subsequent hearing, he realized that the fight in court was not going to end the way he had hoped. It was not what he had expected. There was only one thing left for him to go all the way, and maybe realize that justice is not always found where you look for it. Jackson sat on an old wooden chair in his modest home, once filled with warmth, laughter, and joyful moments. The windows, now stained with dust, no longer let in the light as they once did. The memories he was experiencing remained vivid, but also heavy, like a huge stone that was hard to carry but impossible to give up. The past seemed to him now like something unattainable, something that existed in another life. When he still had money and a luxurious apartment in the city center, life looked very different. All those years of work that he had devoted to his business seemed so important to him now, but at the same time so futile. Everything he had hoped for had crumbled like sand through his fingers, and now all that remained was the memory of an old life that would never return. His gaze slid across the room, and he saw old photos of his family happy, full of energy and hope. Here he and his wife on their first vacation in Hawaii. Here their children at graduation, and here the moment they celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. It was all warm, joyful, and so simple, so far away. Jackson recalled how he built his business, how he strived to achieve financial success. Back then, he believed that he would provide for his family for life, that he would be able to enjoy a carefree old age. And even the thought that something bad could happen did not enter his mind. He was so confident in his goals that he didn't see the trap coming. But now everything looked different. Jackson recalled the moments when he saw his hopes gradually crumble. Step by step, he lost everything he had built for so long. His finances, which had once allowed him to live a carefree life, were now a source of pain and frustration. And now, sitting in his cramped apartment, he realized how much his life had changed. The memories of his old brought him joy for a moment, but then this joy turned to sadness. If only he had known how quickly things could change. If only he could have seen these warning signs he was now recalling, perhaps he would not have fallen into this trap. He remembered how easily he believed in the so-called easy money, in opportunities that seemed too good to be true. And now that he had nothing, he looked back on those memories with a sense of regret. Now he was alone, even though he had once had family and friends on his shoulders. His wife, who had left him after learning of his financial problems, was no longer a part of his life. His children, who had once been his pride, had drifted away, disappointed by his failure. Memories of how he used to celebrate their achievements now seemed like a distant fairy tale. All that remained were shadows from the past. And yet, despite this bitterness, Jackson could not get rid of the memories of that old life that he loved so much and was happy in. It was his most precious possession, even if it could no longer return. He remembered the laughter in the family circle, the warm evenings when everyone sat together discussing the future. He remembered the joy of celebrating each other's successes, the way they used to discuss retirement plans. And now he was sitting alone, and although the memories wouldn't let go, he knew he couldn't change anything. He could not turn back time, and all he could do was accept what had happened. Jackson couldn't change what had already happened, but he knew he couldn't afford to go on with this sadness. He had to take it as a lesson, even though it wasn't easy. Sometimes he still dreamed of that old life, but without hope of returning. The memories remained, and although they brought pain, they also reminded him of how important it was to appreciate every moment, not to lose his way, and not to forget that even in the darkest moments of life, you can find the strength to start again. Jackson was sitting in his old kitchen, holding a cup of cold coffee that he had forgotten to drink a few hours ago. The light from the lamp hanging from the ceiling reflected dimly on the dirty cup. All these small details created a feeling of hopeless emptiness. He looked at his watch. It was late, but he couldn't sleep. Loneliness had become his constant companion. It seemed that not long ago his life was different. He was surrounded by people, had a wife, children, and friends. Now his days were passing without much meaning. Jackson spent most of his time alone, listening only to the sound of his own breathing and the rustle of leaves outside his window. He had once been serious about the future, had hopes for retirement and planned to spend that time relaxing. But now those plans have fallen apart like sand through his fingers. Loneliness became not just a physical condition for him, but also a deep emotional feeling that permeated his every cell. He often recalled the moments when he had a family, when they laughed together and shared their experiences. Now, even in his mind, he could not imagine when it all ended. The time that had passed felt heavy, as if he was stuck somewhere in a dead end. It seemed that all the people he had ever loved had left him, as if the wind had scattered their images, and now there was only emptiness in his life. He often recalled how his wife had disappeared from his life after she found out about all the financial difficulties he had been hiding. She had been his former support, a person he could rely on in times of stress. Now she was just part of this empty space that surrounded Jackson. His children also gradually withdrew. At first they tried to be supportive, but over time, as he began to lose more and more, they turned away. It was hard for them to understand how their father, who had once been a successful businessman, had ended up in this state. And, although he tried to explain to them that it was not his fault, that he was trapped in financial fraud, they could not understand his depth of despair. They had their own families, their own worries, and he couldn't and wouldn't be the burden that was dragging them down. Now Jackson realized how much depended on his actions and decisions. He sat alone, looking around the empty room that had once been so full of life. Everything had changed, and he didn't know how to go back. With his former friends, with whom he had once discussed plans, had gone their separate ways, and even if he met them occasionally, their conversation was not as easy as it used to be. They could not understand his pain, and he could not understand them. Jackson felt a heavy, cold emptiness envelop him. He was not used to this state. He had always been a leader, always had the strength and energy to overcome difficulties. But now, without money and support, he felt broken, lost, and abandoned. It was hard for him to even get out of bed in the morning, because the day seemed like just another reminder that his life was not what he had planned. Loneliness was not just the absence of people around him. It became his internal state. Even he felt forgotten, unwanted. Even when he sometimes went for a walk to get some fresh air, it seemed to him that everything around him was just passing by like shadows. In the city that was once his home, he felt like a stranger. Sometimes he tried to talk to someone, but his conversations were short and meaningless. He felt that people were not interested in what was happening to him. They couldn't understand how hard it was to go through what he was going through because it was something far away, alien to them. Jackson began to doubt whether he had anyone who could understand him at all. The loneliness became not only a physical pain for him, but also a deep emotional rift. He didn't know how to cope with it. He didn't have the strength to get out of this circle. And all that was left was emptiness and the realization that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Jackson stood at the window, looking out at the dark city stretching before him. The streets were empty. The light in the lanterns shivered in the cold breeze, but it did not calm him down. Everything in his life was gradually going wrong, and he didn't know how to stop this process. The true cost of his mistakes was now clear and hard to accept. But even with all this, he could not find answers to the important questions that kept running through his mind. How did he get to this point? How did everything become so hopeless and ruined? He thought that if he turned back the clock, he could change something. But time was merciless. And although Jackson tried to pick up everything he had left, nothing could compensate for what he had lost. His financial difficulties, betrayals, and disappointments left deep scars. Loneliness was a heavy burden that he carried with him every day. He had no more hope or loyal friends to support him in this situation, and his family was hardly in touch, and he felt like an outsider even among those he once loved. It was hard to accept, and even harder to find a way to move on. Was there any way to rebuild what had been destroyed? Jackson doubted it. Perhaps there are those who could start over, change their lives after serious defeats. But for him, this question was not only difficult, but also hopeless. He could not forget how all his decisions had led to this. And, although he had hopes in the beginning, he was now not sure if they were worth keeping. However, even in these sad reflections, there was something that made Jackson question his beliefs. Was his life really over? Is there any way to return from this abyss to a normal life? He didn't know. And here, in this emptiness that engulfed him, a question arose that had no simple answer. What now? Was there anything else he could do? Could he find the inner strength to get up and continue? These questions didn't sound as easy now as they did when he was younger and full of hope. Time had changed him, and he could not be the same as he once was. Realizing this truth became his greatest enemy. Jackson realized that he needed to change his attitude toward life. The way out of this trap was not obvious and did not promise easy solutions. Moreover, there was no one to show him the right way. He sat on the couch and looked closely at an old photo of himself in which he was still a young man full of ambition. Moanatis photo, this moment from the past, now looked like such a distant reality. How had everything changed? Could this catastrophe have been avoided? His hands clenched and his heart beat with a growing sense of anxiety. Omanoa, nothing could be turned back. But was this really the end of the line? Could it be that life goes on even when all seems lost? Jackson was not sure, but he felt that this question would stay with him until the end. The main question that tormented his soul was, is it worth continuing on this path? Is it still possible to find your place in life after such serious mistakes? The sun had already begun to rise, and the light was coming through the windows, filling the room with warmth. But Jackson was in no hurry to get up. He remained sitting there, staring at the horizon, hoping to find at least some answer, some hope that his life could have meaning, even after everything that had happened. But despite all his thought attempts to find a way out, the question remained open. And that was the worst thing, the unknown hanging over him. He had only one thing to do, live with these questions, and maybe one day find answers. But until that moment, his life remained in darkness, which gradually engulfed everything around him.